As you can see, the sun is trying to break out, and slowly that fog wall is moving. But when the beach is misty like this, it kind of makes me think of a time long before European contact, when the early Maliseet and the early Indian people in closely knit family groups might come out to hunt the seal, and wander out around the seaweed beds to gather up the mussels and clams. And search among the many little pockets of the reef for fish left over from the tide. And look for the edible seaweeds like the dalts. Those early Aboriginal people here might come out in the fog and mist and gather up the food resources, just like the great blue heron does. It knows where to find its food resources. Then the people would return to their dwellings of bark and poles, and they would pick up for fire lighting. They had their two methods. One was sparks from flint struck on flint, and the other was the friction fire set, the hand drill, the bow drill. In a very wet environment, humid environment, I am sure that the people had fire sets preserved for use, and fire was very important to those primitive people. According to one Micmac story, there was always one fire burning in a village, always one. And it was maintained, sorry, scratchy throat. It was maintained by the wife of the chief. And they maintained that one fire so that if anyone's house or lodge, shelter, wigwam was bereft of fire, they could always nurture a fire from the village, from the main village fire. They used to keep a fire burning for a long period of time. The legends and tales talk of fires burning for many moons. Basically take a huge old rotten stump of pine and keep it smoldering. Keep it smoldering and burning for months. That way their fire was more easy to make. But the spark technology based on flint and the bow drill and hand drill were the two main sources of fire. And the white stones, what people often think of flint, were very important to these people. The white was actually the chalk layering over the chert or the flint. You could always get sparks off those. They might be weaker than the sparks you'll get off our modern day fire steel, but they were still sparks nonetheless. So after a family was busy hunting the seal or going after the fish and gathering the mussels and the clams and the seaweeds, they would make sure that they had a fire in their shelter to keep them warm against the fog or the rain. There is one thing that a lot of people never ever consider, is that when you're wearing an animal hide at any form of tailored hide at all, it soaks up water just like cotton soaks up water, and it loses its insulation properties. So these people had to make sure that they had a means of keeping their hide clothing dry. Before the days of contact, sealskin clothing was very common. Sealskin garments and moose hide garments. They were all very common here. But then Europeans came, and many things happened, and the native peoples, Micmac, Maliseet, Massapquoddy, they adopted the manner of dress like in Europe. Top hats, long coats, long dresses. They were usually quite colorful, of course, for the women that wanted to wear a colorful dress, etc. But in adopting the religions and the clothing of the European, the native peoples lost many things, like the right to hunt in traditional hunting grounds, the right to travel from one district into another district. They were no longer able to travel across the districts because Europeans, colonials, didn't want native peoples trespassing on their land. There was still a lot of misunderstanding. And even when Acadia fell, that was proven quite evident when the British sent the Acadians packing, and the British took over the Acadian farms and towns and stuff like that. You see the Acadians, the French Acadians from, and their ancestors, or descendants I should say, they were quite friendly with the Micmac and they intermarried with some. And the Acadians existed along the coast, while the Micmac and the other tribes, Algonquin-speaking tribes, existed inland. The tribes people did come to the coast to fish, but the native peoples really lived inland. And inland is where the Acadian farmers didn't want to make their farms and stuff because there was too much deep forest. When the British sent the Acadians packing, the British basically took away all rights of the native peoples in Acadia. And Acadia at the time consisted of PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Maine. Maine there was a big part of Maine that was considered Acadia. So the Algonquin tribes in the region decided to go to war with the British for a time. They called them the Wagon Burner Days. And eventually treaties were worked out. But the heyday of the Passamaquoddy and the Maliseet and the Micmac and the Abenaki, that heyday was gone. So now a foggy beach like this, with all its features wreathered in mist, would make a real historian think about the ancient families and tribes that once used this land. The only thing that you will find of these former peoples today are artifacts. Stone knives, stone adzes, stone axes. Even the ornaments that were worn on hair and clothing, they're out there in the fog. They're out there in the fog, buried in a landscape, waiting for the tide to uncover them. And when a modern person of today manages to stumble onto something out of the ordinary, they just don't realize that a whole race of people once happily existed and lived quite healthily and happily. I think that's enough of this video. I'll just relax for a few minutes in the silence and enjoy a foggy beach.